Welcome to All That Work for Nothing. And boy, have we done a lot of work this week.
We really have.
So we're adding to what we did last week, which was look at 1968 and compare it to 2024. We were hyper-focused on that one, on the campus protests and kind of how they related today, especially one particular school. Now we're going to go a little bit more broad, and we're going to talk about the election, because that's probably the next big thing we got coming up this year is the election in November. 1968 was an election year. It was
a very pivotal election.
Yes. Historically, it's seen as one of the most important elections in American history. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Doyle and I are both history majors. We both love history. We've loved doing this kind of research. 1968, very pivotal election. We're going to talk about the major players in that election and kind of how it all played out and some similarities that we see today. But our big arching theme is going to be really like how we got here. Because I tell this to Doria all the time, primary season, like what we just had back in March and April, used to be my favorite time to watch politics. I thought it was the most entertaining time. I thought it was a lot of fun. I liked all the little intrigues.
It was like the NFL draft of politics.
It had the NFL draft vibe. Yes, it had the NFL draft where this wasn't really important, but it gave you like this sense of like what could be. Now all that's gone because we basically had two of the most boring primaries in the history of America.
Well, and similar to the political atmosphere in 1968, no one really likes who's running this time around. Okay, so we're kind of like back in 1968, people were kind of just like, I mean, we're in the middle of a war. Our current president keeps promising that we're going to pull out of Vietnam, but he keeps upping the ante and sending more kids to war. And it is more so kids. It's more so like freshly 18-year-old boys getting sent off to war. And we're watching this war for the first time on our TVs, and we're seeing like, wait, why are we sending these boys over there? We're losing. And there's no way to hide that anymore from the American people. So we're just like, we want to uproot our government, right? And we want to take out the players that are in there that aren't doing what we want, and we want to basically just like build from the ground up. And that's where we are today as well. We kind of are like, okay, this isn't working, what's going on right now for both sides. There's a lot of unrest amongst people, and we're all kind of like, hey, I think we should do that again, where we should just, dig out the people that we don't want anymore, and we need to build from the ground up. But the players that are involved are kind of like lackluster and kind of
lacking.
They're lacking, for lack of a better term.
They've been found wanting.
They have been found wanting.
I think a lot of that's our generation is the restart generation. The turn on and turn it back off generation. Or if you're like me, like take the cartridge out and blow on it generation. And the fact that we can't do that in the most pivotal aspect of our lives is so frustrating. The fact that we just can't hit the reset button on all these people and just kind of start with a blank slate when it's something that affects our day to day is miserable.
I think honestly we just need to take like a power washer, to Congress and just just go in there and really like just get all the gunk out. And by gunk I mean the gently alive corpses out of Congress that are running this country into the ground. So anyways, we will get back to 1968 and I will let you take it away, honey.
Sure. So in that documentary we watched, that CNN documentary, we kind of noticed that there was a star. At least I noticed that there was like a star in this whole thing. There's one guy who kind of drew all the attention. And it was Richard Nixon. So,
which is funny because before he was not well liked.
No,
at all.
Not at all. He was he was kind of considered dead politically. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how he got there. But I think Richard Nixon is one of the most well-known presidents, not for a good reason.
Yes, not for a good reason.
But there is a lot more to know about Nixon, both good and bad. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the lead up to 1968. So I have a very unique connection with Richard Nixon. So he was born in Yorba Linda, California, which is where my mom grew up. And then he also, after that, moved to Whittier, California, in like a small kind of Quaker community where his dad ran a grocery store. And Whittier is where my grandmother grew up. And then once he stopped becoming president, he had what they called a Western White House, which was a really nice mansion on the cliffs of San Clemente, which is where I grew up.
Wow.
Yeah.
You followed. Your family just really loves Richard Nixon.
I don't know what it is about him. He was the first California president, which is cool. Sidetrack. I was actually going through an airport one time, and I had my San Clemente High School shirt on.
Yeah.
And this random guy just stops me and goes, "San Clemente High School? What are you, the Nixons?" Because people knew San Clemente and Nixon like that.
Okay.
If you were a certain generation, the names were just connected like that. So Richard Nixon has kind of always been a figure in my life. When he died in 1994, great year. When he died, my mom took me and my sister to see him when he was interned, when his casket was put on display. They do this for every president.
It's so creepy.
It is a little creepy.
It's real creepy.
Look at the dead body, kids.
Look at the dead president, everyone.
No, isn't he so great, all dead?
Now he's going in the ground. Say goodbye.
Also, what if a president wanted to get cremated?
I know, right?
It never even comes
I
up.
guess it's closed casket nowadays.
I guess that's true.
Yeah, who knows? It's a closed casket, so maybe. But also, I do know sometimes they'll have the funeral with them in a casket. Mm-hmm. Just because as humans we have object permanence, so we want to see the dead body sometimes, and we want to and even if we don't see it, we want to have the comfort of knowing that they're still there. Their husk is in there. Yeah. And so I know sometimes they'll do that, and then directly after the funeral, they'll have them cremated. So that could be, yeah.
And then Richard Nixon Library is also where I went when I was 8. I think it was 8 or 9. I went there for a Civil War reenactment.
Fun.
And this is where my kind of love for the Civil War started, because it was basically these guys were just camping, hanging out, and having a war reenactment. And so that catapulted my love of the Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
Also, one of the reenactors let me hold his gun. So that, for an 8-year-old boy, I was in.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah.
So this this guy who's not a popular president has always just kind of been lingering around in the background of my love of history. And he has a interesting story. He definitely had one of the most humble beginnings for a president. Like I said, he grew up in a small Quaker little community in Whittier, California. He went to Whittier College. He actually got a full ride to Harvard.
Really?
Like a grant to go to Harvard, but his dad or his brother was sick, and so he had to stay home and run the grocery store. So he went to Whittier College instead, and then went to Duke's Law School, became a lawyer. There's a story out there that I can't confirm because I only found it in one article, and I didn't find any other reputable sources to back it up. But apparently in Nixon's first case, the judge admonished him and said that he was one of the most unscrupulous people he'd ever met.
Really?
And that he had a trouble with the truth.
Okay.
And that's going to come up later.
I was going to say, well, if you follow his political career, you'll see that kind of never went away.
And then, yes, so his political career starts after World War II. So he goes into military service. He was a lieutenant commander in the Navy, and he runs against a 5-time congressman named Jerry Voorhees, and he beats Voorhees, and kind of the whole Republicans sweep in 1946 because World War II had just ended. FDR was dead, and he was so popular that he was kind of carrying the whole Democrats for a while. So once he died, people were kind of more conservative and very scared of communists. If you've seen Oppenheimer, this isn't that post-World War II time when everyone's communists.
What we like to call is the Red Scare.
The Red Scare, yes. And Nixon is a big deal in the Red Scare because he serves on the House of Un-American Affairs Committee, which is the one that did all the investigating. He becomes a national figure in his second year in Congress.
Wow.
So 1948, he has this really big case called the Pumpkin Papers, where he basically, we can go into it more later, but this vaults him into a national figure.
Gotcha.
Everybody knows who Richard Nixon is. And then he competes.
Because he's pointing out dirty, rotten commies.
He's pointing out dirty, rotten commies. The case itself is super interesting. It's called the Pumpkin Papers or the Alger Hiss affair, and you can look into it more. It's super interesting. It's one of those things that Nixon does so much dirty stuff later in his life that people kind of look over this, but it's got a lot of intrigue to it. So this makes him a national figure, and people who are like very anti-communist and conservative think that this guy is like a hero. So he wins the California Senate election in 1950, and he defeats actually a woman, and her name was Helen Gagan Douglas, and she was a former actress. She was very, very wealthy, and she was a very, very liberal. She got called a bleeding heart liberal. They called her a parlor pink. Hollywood parlor pink, whatever that means. Pink is kind of a term that's comes up a lot as in referring to like communists, and it also kind of has that like hit of being soft.
Yeah.
Pink. And so
you're not all the way red, you're pink. And
the Nixon plays into this and like frames her basically as like almost like a commie, like a commie loving, Hollywood, aloof, out of the touch kind of type.
Yeah.
And Nixon's of the common man, and he just wants his family to not have to live in fear of communism. And he calls Helen Gagan Douglas He calls Helen Gagan Douglas pink right down to her underwear.
Gross.
Right?
Why
Gross.
are you talking about a woman's underwear, buddy?
Yeah, seriously. Why are you talking about a woman's underwear in an election? And everyone just laughed and giggled right along with him.
Yeah.
And he starts to develop this strategy that's going to carry him into 1968, which is basically avoid the issues.
Yeah.
So avoid the issues, and he's going to run kind of on a fear-based, emotion-based campaign. And he
sounds very familiar.
Yes, and that's how he's going to get all these people's votes, right?
Yeah.
He's just skirts the issues, doesn't take a really hard stance, but he's got the feels,
Yeah.
And a lot of people didn't like Helen Gagan Douglas, including JFK, who gave $1,000 to Nixon's campaign to beat her.
Okay.
And then they come.
I mean, that doesn't really surprise me
No.
because JFK was he was not a good man.
No.
He was not a good person. He was a dickhead to his wife.
Yes. So these two he gets into Congress at the same time too. Mm-hmm. So these two dickheads come into Congress together, basically.
And they touch tips.
They touch tips.
They touch political tips.
Which is why it was so hard for them to compete against each other 10 years later in 1960. So 52 to 60, he's vice president. Mm-hmm. Then he runs against JFK in 60 and loses. It's really close. It pretty much comes down to just a couple states and like a few 100,000 votes, if that. But he loses to JFK, and then in 1962, he runs for governor of California and loses there. So this is when he has that famous line where he goes, "You won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore."
Oh, God. And
so his career looks over. His career looks dead. But here we are, 1968, and Nixon's back, baby!
Back and better than ever, baby.
Back and better than ever. But the Republican Party is very different.
When did he start doing this thing?
Oh, that was 1968.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, we'll get to that. We'll get to why he kind of uses that and how he uses that.
Can I have a side note?
Of course.
Okay, so there was this guy that was an anarchist that I went to school with when I was a freshman in high school. And for whatever reason, he would always be like, Nixon! And he was a very outspoken anarchist that I went to school with, and he was also not a good person. So,
so he would have been friends with Nixon.
He would have been real good friends with. Maybe that's why he liked Nixon so much.
Oh my gosh, he wanted.
Although he talked shit about Nixon a lot, so which is why he, because he was an anarchist, so he was one of those guys that knew everything there is to know about all of the political, the big political people.
Yeah.
And then he would be like, see, they're just bringing down the system, man. I'm like, dude, you are 14 years old.
Yeah, you need to relax.
I wonder whatever happened to that kid. Because after freshman year, he kind of just pissed off, and I don't know whatever happened to him. Anyways, back to 1968. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I knew anarchist kids too. They would write the A everywhere like that.
Yeah.
And I was just scared of them. I was just like, ugh.
It's funny because when you see the anarchist symbol now, you just think of the Avengers.
Right?
And I'm like, did they do that on purpose?
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
They just erased anarchism.
Yeah.
Goddamn mouse.
Mm-hmm. Goddamn mouse. Anyways, sorry, back to 1968.
That's okay. So when Nixon got selected for vice president in 1952, it was kind of to balance out the ticket because Eisenhower was way more on like the liberal side of the Republican Party. So in the 1950s, there was the liberal side and the conservative side of the Republican Party. In 1960, they lose with Nixon. So at this point, they had pretty much gone with a liberal candidate like every year from 1940 to 1960, and they'd only won with Eisenhower, who was like a freaking war hero. So in 1964, they're like, fuck this, no more. We are going hard to the right.
Yeah.
And this is when they have Barry Goldwater. And Barry Goldwater is a very interesting guy. Definitely worth looking up. Barry Goldwater voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, but was a member of the NAACP. And voted for the earlier civil rights acts. And he was a staunch anti-communist, and that was kind of what like got him so popular. And he didn't really, know a lot about world affairs, and slipped up and said that he would think about nuking Vietnam because Vietnam was still an issue in 1964. Okay. And so people are terrified of him. And so Goldwater wins the Republican nomination and gets absolutely fucking massacred. He is the biggest popular vote loss in history. But what happens is that the solid South, most of the Deep South went for Goldwater because of his opposition to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So when the 1966 election happens, people thought after 64 that conservatism was dead.
Yeah.
That they thought that after this ass whooping, everybody was just going to like not want another Goldwater. But what happens is the student protests and the inner city riots, like the riots in Watts and the riots across the country, plus like the student protests in Berkeley and stuff like that, kind of give something for conservatives to consolidate against.
Right.
So when we get to 1968, so it gave them something like a rallying cry, like these ungrateful, like wealthy kids who don't want to go to war like we did, and then these like scary black people rioting in the inner city. Oh, it's just terrible. So in 1966, you get two guys that I think kind of epitomize this new conservative movement. One is our old buddy. You know him.
You love him.
You love him. It's Reagan.
I feel bad for smiling at that.
So, yes, former film star of Bedtime for Bonzo.
What a great name. Bedtime for Bonzo.
He has to chase a chimp around in that movie. I've seen clips of it, and it's just as amazing as you'd think.
Yikes.
So he was head of the Screen Actors Guild. He meets Nancy Reagan, who comes from a very well-to-do family, and she kind of pushes him towards the right. And then eventually he starts to become like a spokesman for right-wing politics in California. And so he like talks against like universal health care and all this stuff. And pretty soon, like guys like John Wayne are backing him for governor, and he wins governor in 1966 because of people's fear of these college protesters. So, all these crazy liberals at Berkeley were freaking out the poor white people, and so they elected Reagan because his whole thing was just like, I'm going to be tough on them. Now, the other person we have is Strom Thurmond. And you might remember him because he's from South Carolina. And
South Carolina.
And every time I read that, I'm like, I think of your old teacher that you talked about. Who was like, and where was this asshole from?
Yes. I took a college course on the Civil War, and my professor was so funny. So every time she would introduce like a new character or like leader in the war, or like if say something were to happen, she'd be like, and where did it happen? And the entire class would be like, South Carolina. Because the war starts in South Carolina, it ends in South Carolina, and all these crazy freaking batshit crazy people come from South Carolina, and they just are batshit crazy the whole time. So yeah, that's what he's referring to.
It is a historical fact that if you are in politics and you come from South Carolina, you are going to be batshit.
Batshit crazy.
I'm struggling to think of somebody who wasn't. Oh, so the story that Strom Thurmond might be most famous for is in 1957 was the first Civil Rights Act of the 20th century. And Strom Thurmond filibustered the Civil Rights Act by how they used to do a filibuster. So a filibuster used to be like you had to actually stand there and talk. Mm-hmm. And its original strategy was like people would try to pass legislation. And so you would talk until like you could get backup pretty much to come in so that you would have enough votes to either to stop whatever these people were trying to pass from passing.
If you ever want to see a good example of filibustering, watch Parks and Rec.
Yes. And just like in
Parks
and Rec, like when Leslie Knope had to pee, Strom Thurmond had to pee. Mm-hmm. But instead of like, holding it, he had somebody put a sheet and he just kind of turned the corner in the hallway and just pissed while still talking.
What the fuck?
Yes. And keep in mind, this is the Civil Rights Act that he was talking against. So you can kind of guess where his point was in this whole deal.
Disgusting.
So Strom Thurmond is classic.
He's like, rats? What kind of rights do these people?
Yes.
This is what I think about their rights right now.
No, that was the vibe. That was 100%
and he's from?
the vibe. South Carolina.
Makes a lot of sense.
So he was the typical Southern Democrat. In 1966, he switches to the Republican Party.
Okay.
And 57 was a big year. So 57 was the year of the Southern Manifesto, and it was the year of the Little Rock Nine. So when they came in and forcibly integrated schools.
Yeah.
And this creates this kind of awful cabal between these like anti-New Deal Republicans, these like small governments kind of dudes who were everywhere. And then these new racists who were upset that the Democrats weren't doing enough against civil rights.
Yeah.
And then when Kennedy gets elected in 60 with a strong civil rights campaign, now these Democrats are really starting to struggle with their identity. And then Johnson, even though he was a Southerner, pursues civil rights even further and passes the Civil Rights Act. So when 66 comes along, a lot of these Southern Democrats look to the Democratic Party and kind of don't like what they see. Mm-hmm. So a lot of them join with these states' rights, small government kind of Republicans, and they win this union, this alliance, helps them gain 47 seats in the House and 3 in the Senate.
Even after losing the Civil War, all these years later, they're still like, states' rights.
States' rights.
I'll never forget about states' rights.
It's funny. States' rights never comes up unless it has something to do with race. The two are linked together.
Well, race and controlling women.
Yes.
And their bodies. So.
Yeah, we will get to that. There's a transition that happens there, which we will see. Now, so all this leads up to the 1968 RNC. And Nixon has won every single primary. He's won it convincingly. The last kind of bastion of liberal Republicans is Nelson Rockefeller Jr., and yes, he's the son of that Nelson Rockefeller. And he is like, if you looked at his policies today, you're like, oh, this guy's a Democrat. But no, he was the last liberal Republican. He gets absolutely trounced. But people still don't like Nixon for obvious reasons. One, interestingly enough, even though in 1952 he was the conservative to balance out the ticket, now he's too wish-washy liberal. So he almost gets beaten by Reagan, who joined super late, and a lot of the Southern conservatives love Reagan. They just love Reagan. But Strom Thurmond is the one who gets them to back Nixon on one condition, that when he gets in there, he's going to start repealing a lot of these pro-civil rights policies of Johnson and Kennedy.
Yeah.
And if you watch our episode on the Washington football team, you'll know that Kennedy's civil rights policies were actually starting to have positive impacts. The simple, simply having a policy that's geared towards civil rights can just having an administration that actually gives a shit about civil rights can change so much.
Right.
So he promises the Southern Democrats that he won't be that guy. That he will repeal a lot of these civil rights policies that had been put in place by the Democrats. So he takes the stage at the RNC and he kind of sets up his campaign. So he's going to be the law and order candidate, and he's going to bring us together. And he has a secret plan for Vietnam. Now, there's no specifics there, right? There ain't nothing, there's not a single thing that's specific there.
Yeah, that's so funny. Yeah,
he runs strictly on vibes,
and that's still seen today. You know what I mean? Like, so many of these people they're not forthcoming with what they're doing, and also like a lot of them make false promises with things that they have no control over as president, and it's just funny. Like, it's been around for as long as politics has been around, but it's crazy how eerily similar everything is with all of this shit happening now, and then all of this shit that happened back then. And I'm hoping that this is a good thing, because, you know, after this election and into the 70s and the 80s, things started getting better, right? Except for like a few political things, but things started going better in the country and for people. There was a new wave of feminism, and women were finally getting out of the house, and they were going into and getting their own revenue streams, and it wasn't all like the nuclear family anymore. So I'm hoping that, because like right now it's just, this country is so
right.
There's people going to college, and there's not enough jobs for these kids going to college now. There's no asses that they can put in seats.
So it's funny you bring up the wave of feminism, the wave of civil rights that were happening. Now, publicly, Nixon didn't want to like be counter to any of that, because if he had just come out as like a hard line against everything that was counterculture, he probably would have lost. Yeah. But his strategy was pretty much to be like, he's understanding of the counterculture, but like that doesn't mean we need to like just
give in to them.
Well, that doesn't mean we need to like forget law and order. We need to like follow the rules and stay in line. But yes, if I know things are changing, and this is the new Nixon. That was the one we heard a lot.
The new Nixon.
The new Nixon.
Because for like Nixon really was seen to voters. He was kind of seen as someone who like he was saying wishy-washy, but also they're like, what kind of personality does he have? Ugh. For whatever reason. Well, no, I get it. We want to see, like, in our president, we want to see someone that we would go and grab a drink with. That's one of the biggest things that the American public kind of likes about its presidents, is that we want to see ourselves in the person who's representing us as a country. We have not seen that in a very long time in this country. And that's kind of the sentiment back then. It was even more so than now, where it was like, I wouldn't go grab a drink with that guy. He's boring as hell. Yeah. Like, I don't know where he stands on anything. He was the Aaron Burr of the 1960s. Where do you stand, Burr?
In a lot of ways. Yeah. But the thing is that as bad as that was in 1960 for him, now in 1968, it could be used kind of as a weapon, because it was in such this transition period that if you took a hard stance on one issue, you would upset one sect of the country. Yeah. So by being kind of ambivalent on everything, but capturing the vibe and capturing kind of the feeling at the time is the strategy he used to win. Yes.
And that's the whole reason he kind of like, all of a sudden he was likable, and he was like smiling all the time, and he was very much like, you know, I'm a politician, and I'm gonna go in there, and I'm gonna law and order and blah blah blah. And then all of a sudden you see all these videos of him campaigning, and he's like, oh, hi everyone, oh my god, it's you, oh, I remember you, like, you know, kissing babies' heads and signing women's breasts.
Like he's Happy Gilmore.
Not really, but yeah, he's basically becoming the, like, kind of like JFK was, where people were like, oh, wow, who is this guy? He seems cool.
Now, interestingly,
I want to vote for him.
Interestingly, like the way Nixon lost the debate to JFK, in 1960 is the same reason why he didn't debate in 68, but he did something different. He did these like town hall of vibes.
That's right.
So these very, very orchestrated kind of...
But they weren't seen as orchestrated.
Right.
He made it seem like he didn't know what they were going to ask him. Mm-hmm. And it was all women asking him questions.
Yes, it was. So it was orchestrated to look like he wasn't getting softball questions, but they were questions that he had gone over before. So this way, it looked like he wasn't afraid of hard questions, and he could also like be very approachable.
Yeah,
be very like somebody that anybody could go up to and talk to. And like you said, it was a lot of women. It was all women asking questions. So it was all women, very few people of color, but this kind of framed him in a more approachable light. Now, this Law and Order kind of campaign phrasing he was using resonated with a lot of people, especially in 1968 when it seemed like Law and Order was becoming something that was losing traction in America, or at least it was framed as losing traction in America. So this is exemplified.
Mainly because of the civil rights movement.
Yes, a lot of this is framed because of the civil rights movement and agitation, and also the anti-war movement, right?
Yes.
Which, even though most people weren't for the war, and a lot of people were for civil rights,
but how dare they go out in the streets and picket for it?
Yeah, they just didn't want you to talk about it. Could you just not talk about it? Could you just not?
See, that's what I don't understand about a lot of these people that didn't that were pissed off about the anti-war, because like we've talked about the whole country as a whole, we were not happy about being in Vietnam. We wanted to get our boys back. We wanted them out of there. But how dare you stand up and go and picket this and bring it into public attention? It's weird to me. It's a constitutional right that we should definitely exercise, and we're seeing it again today with the campus protests and the protests seen throughout the country against an act of genocide, where people are like, don't talk about it. And
right.
Just don't. Why would you do that? No, absolutely use that voice. It's why we have that constitutional right. And if we don't use that voice, that they don't want us to use our voice. They don't want us flexing the fact that we have the right to question our government, and we absolutely should. That's what keeps this democracy working as a democracy. Sorry, go ahead.
No. That was great, because that leads me into my next point, which Nixon gets a huge opportunity to kind of rally his side against something and have this Law and Order rhetoric hit home. About a month, I think, later after the RNC is the DNC in Chicago.
Oh, is that
That's you?
Okay. All right. Yeah. So I am going to be talking about the DNC, the Democratic National Convention. And you're probably asking, why are we having a DNC? Don't we have a president who is a Democrat who's in office? Well, my friends, LBJ at this point he's let down. He was like, he had high political aspirations for himself, and he finds himself in the middle of public scrutiny. People in America are not happy with the way that he's running the war, and the fact that he lied to people in his platform when he ran for president before, saying, "Oh no, don't worry about it. I'm not going to do anything about, we're going to get out of Vietnam. Okay? We don't need to be there. It'll be okay." Then he comes in and he does 2 drafts. And people are pissed. People are unhappy. And no matter what he does, even if he tries to make it seem like he's pulling out or doing something else, there's just no winning for him. So he finally concedes and he goes, "I will not be accepting the nomination to be your president again. I will not be running." And people are floored. They're just like, "Dude, we're in the middle of a freaking crazy ass war. You're in the middle of a draft, and you're telling us that you're just like peacing out? Like, what the hell?" So people are pissed, and also people are just like scrambling. So this is crazy, because the Democratic Party I don't think the Democratic Party saw this coming. So they're just like, "Oh shit, we need to throw people in there. Who do we throw in there?" So here we go. So for the Democratic National Convention, it's going to be held in August of 1968. So the talks for this begin in April of where we're going to hold this convention. And Chicago is chosen. And the reason that Chicago is chosen is because, like we were saying, there's protests throughout the country and they're becoming violent. Chicago has escaped this violence and most protests because of their mayor, Richard Daley, who is kind of an extremist and very much like, this is my city and I won't stand for anyone being political in it except for me, blah, blah, blah. So anyways, they pick Chicago because, other big players like New York and LA, they're seeing a bunch of students standing up for their rights and protesting the civil rights movement, and they're protesting the war. So they put their sights on Chicago, and Mayor Daley sees this as a wonderful thing. He's like, yes, come to Chicago. You guys will see, like, this is the best city. There's there's law and order here. There's no crazy terrorists. He called these anti-war protesters terrorists.
Oh, wow.
He's like, there's no terrorists in this city. Like, you can just like walk around and, like feel safe and warm and fuzzy. So he's really excited for it. So after the assassination of Martin Luther King, riots start breaking out in Chicago. So, as soon as we decide that we're going to or as soon as they decide that Chicago is the hub for the DNC, riots break out. Okay. And I don't know if you've heard this, but like if you hear South Side, it usually means in Chicago.
Yeah.
So there's this, like, it's kind of split into two of North and South Chicago. So northern Chicago is more well-to-do, more white prevalent, and South Side Chicago is more seen as the people of color, mainly black, and they tried to paint it as lawless and kind of, because it's people of color and they're on the poorer side of economics. And so he sends in these policemen to kind of rein it in, because people are very upset, and I understand why. Martin Luther King was the leader of the civil rights movement, and it looks like it's slipping away. It already looked like it was slipping away before, because the last time they went on a march in Memphis, Tennessee, things did not go well. Some of the people that were protesting were tired of being complacent, and we're basically like, hey, we've been doing this for a few years now. No one's taking us seriously. I'm fucking tired of it. They keep sending in the police to beat the absolute shit out of us and use their firearms, their clubs. They're putting us in jail. Nothing is working. So people are getting upset. Violence breaks out at this walk, and it makes the movement start to look more militant, right? So people are kind of discouraged. And so when Martin Luther King is like, listen, we're going to do it again. All right, everyone, we're doing it again. Immediately the next day after he says that, he gets assassinated. So the sentiment is not good. Yes. People are very upset. So, and of course, it's more in the south end of Chicago, but it's also seen in the north as well. So it's not just the southern end. It's also in the northern end of Chicago, where you see people, and it's in the northern end, it's more like anti-war, like they're just tired of what's going on in this country.
Things that affected them.
Things that affected them, yes. So the mayor, he sends the police officers over to the south side, and he says, shoot to kill. He tells these police officers, if you see anyone looting, if you see anyone with a stick in their hand or with a rock in their hand, you shoot to kill. And so this is when things turn very violent in Chicago. And like I was saying, Daley sees Chicago as like his town. His dad before him was in politics. And so he grew up watching his dad watch over Chicago. So it was his home. And so he took this very personally, and that's why he decided to strong arm these protests and back to the Democratic National Convention. We have our anti-war candidates. So these are the guys that are saying that their platform is going to be getting us out of Vietnam. And then we have Eugene McCarthy and we have Robert Kennedy. So they're the two biggest players that are vying for a seat. And they 2 months before the DNC, Robert Kennedy is assassinated at a rally. So the guy who takes over for him and takes his seat is George McGovern, and that's the guy that we'll see later on at the DNC. So with this assassination of RFK, we see a shift in Americans. Americans were very hopeful in the Democratic Party at this point. They were like, they believed that, especially with RFK. RFK was very well liked. He was very much like his brother, you know, very good being in front of crowds and saying the right things, talking to the right people. People really saw him and saw like they had a hope inside their heart. As soon as he was assassinated, it was the same kind of thing with Martin Luther King, where they're like, well, fuck, there goes the country again. There goes, us getting out of the fucking war. So they don't like the candidates that they're choosing in the Democratic Party, besides RFK. Like, he was the main guy that everyone thought was going to win. So a lot of people thought that the Democratic Party was going to be able to save the United States and get us out of this war. But as soon as he passes away, people are like kind of stepping back a little bit, and that's what we're coming into in the Democratic National Convention. And
what I didn't realize until we watched that documentary is that how much it wiped out Eugene McCarthy too.
Yeah,
because it just kind of like took his heart out of the race.
Yes.
So in this one shot, it took out the two anti-war candidates essentially.
Yeah. Okay. So, the candidate who is pro-war, and the reason this man is pro-war is because the Johnson will only back a pro-war candidate for the Democratic Party. And the reason for that is because, like I said, Johnson is in a mell of a hess. He finds himself in the middle of this very controversial war. We're definitely losing, and he's trying to make it seem like we're not. He keeps sending over people. People are pissed and are just like, bro, stop this madness. So he's like, so what he doesn't want is he doesn't want someone like RFK or someone like McCarthy to win this seat, because if they come in and they pull us out of Vietnam directly after Johnson gets out of office, Johnson is painted as the bad guy. He will always be the guy that fucked us up in Vietnam, right? So that's what he doesn't want. So he wants someone that he is going to endorse, someone who is going to have the same kind of platform that he does. And this is where we kind of see a shift in the Democratic Party. So we have anti-war Democrats and we have pro-war Democrats. And the pro-war Democrat we have is Hubert Humphrey, who was actually the vice president to Johnson at this time. Johnson is another one of those guys that no one really likes. He kind of has no personality other than old man.
I don't even think he was like that old at the time, but he has old man energy.
He does, but he's like, he's balding and he kind of looks like people just didn't see themselves in him.
No.
At all. So he's coming in and people are just like, this guy? Come on. So yeah, this is a huge shift in the Democratic Party at this time.
All these former vice president, old men, balding, white-haired dudes, Always got to be skeptical.
Yeah.
Give them that skeptical eye.
So in the meantime, Mayor Daley is rejecting any permits for anti-war protesters to occupy any space in Chicago. And this only makes tensions in the community grow. It's just getting worse. So the first day of the DNC arrives. And I have a fun fact for you.
Ooh.
Which I didn't know this. Aretha Franklin sang the national anthem to open it up. Which I thought, really? Yeah, I thought that was really cool.
That is really cool. Yeah. I did not know that.
They showed a snippet of it, and I was like, "Go off, Queen."
Well, I think.
But also, I was just like,
there was weirdly a lot of celebrities there.
Yeah,
like
there was.
A lot of celebrities were delegates. Mm-hmm. Like I think Paul Newman was there, which badass.
Okay, I didn't see that. But yeah, I thought it was really cool that they had Aretha Franklin because I was like, "Go off, Queen." But also like. It kind of was like a little bit ironic that they had a person of color singing the national anthem when they're like trying to not pass this like anti-war legislation and civil rights movement legislation.
Well, to be fair, Hubert Humphrey was a big civil rights guy. Like
that is true. That is true. You're
going
right.
back in
You're
the
right.
time.
But it was. I just thought it was cool. Anyways,
very cool fun fact.
So tensions inside the Democratic Party. Tensions inside the Democratic Party have been rising with the war and anti-war platforms. So most delegates were picked by like-minded party insiders who were all backing Humphrey, which is a no-no. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Humphrey is kind of like hijacking the Democratic Party, and it's because of Johnson's kind of persuasion a little bit, where he's just like, you don't want us to get out of there, like that's dangerous, like, you know, he's trying to really, you know, put people strings. He's pulling strings behind. And then also Johnson does not show up to the Democratic National Convention, right? Okay, so people are like, where the fuck is this guy, you know? And he's just like, peace out, everyone. So it's like,
sucks to suck, y'all.
No one likes Humphrey. Okay, no one likes him. There are a few rogue delegates that are backing McCarthy. Okay. So there are some people that are outcrying and being like, no, we want McCarthy. We want to get the fuck out of this war. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, outside of the convention center, we have 10,000 protesters starting to arrive at Lincoln Park. And Lincoln Park is in the surrounding area of the DNC. Mm-hmm. And like I said, they did not get any permits from Mayor Daley, but they were like, we're still coming. It's our right to protest this shit. And by the way, what put the Democratic National Convention on the hit list of anti-war protesters was the fact that Mayor Daley fucked shit up with sending police officers to shoot to kill for the protests after Martin Luther King died. So it's because of his poor response to that these anti-war demonstrators are like, oh, we can make a statement now, because they weren't going to go there. That wasn't really on their radar until he made that poor decision. And then it was like, oh, now we have to go. You know what I mean? So they really rallied them together. So many of these people can't afford lodging, so they just were like, we'll just sleep out here. We brought little tents. None of them brought tents. They were literally just sleeping like whatever they had on them. Yeah. Some people had these like makeshift beds. Some people had sleeping bags, and they just like kind of were deciding that they were just going to sleep right there. So police were like, nah. So Daley sends in the police officers, and they're kind of surrounding them as the day goes on, and they're kind of monitoring them. And then they are given the order that at 10 p.m. they have to call for curfew and be like, hey, get the fuck out of here. It's 10 p.m., but Lincoln Park is closed. Mm-hmm. And these protesters are like, nah. So they kind of form like a little chain link, and they're like, no, we're not moving. We are allowed to be here. We're allowed to use our voice. And they're like, yeah, but you're on public property, and this is a park, so you gotta GTFO. So they come in with their helmets, which back then was their kind of riot gear.
Essentially riot gear,
because you wouldn't really see a police officer like just randomly wearing a helmet unless he was planning some kind of riot, right? So, in order to get these guys out of there, they come with helmets and tear gas to clear the park. While this is happening on the inside of the Democratic Convention, there's a big debate that breaks out, and it's for the war versus no war, and it's over the peace plank.
Right.
And the peace plank was a de-escalation kind of like policy that they were talking about of like winding down U.S. presence in Vietnam. So people are literally screaming at each other. There's dudes just like standing up and being like, dude, no, how fucking like screaming back and forth, and it looks like mayhem in there. So it's mayhem outside, it's mayhem inside. It's turning into craziness, okay? So a little scuffle begins with members of the press and security for the convention. There was a member of the press who was trying to talk to a delegate from, I don't remember where, Illinois somewhere. The security officer comes out of nowhere and he's like, he literally grabs this guy and shoves him out of the way. And he's like, I'm not doing anything. I'm asking him questions. Mm-hmm. So while the police are being, the security for the convention are being pushy with the press, the police officers outside are also being pushy with the press, and they're not allowing them inside. And we find out later that Daley had decided that he didn't want people to see the mayhem that was going on in the media, right?
Yeah.
So he was trying to get these media dudes out of there, which just made it worse because they're like, well, we have we can't go in there, right? But we can still talk about this and we can still show you on camera trying to prevent us from entering. So that's going to make you look worse. Okay? So.
I was just going to say, it's almost kind of like, you know, when like Karen videos and they're like, you can't record me. You can't record me.
Yeah.
That was kind of, because TV was still kind of new. So he was probably just like, no, they can't record. They don't have the right to.
And they absolutely can.
And they absolutely can.
So anyways, protesters at this point, they begin chanting, which it gave me goosebumps. The whole world is watching. And they're just chanting this and chanting this and chanting this. And they're all uniting together. And they're like, and it's true. The whole world is watching. Mm-hmm. We have these, like never before we have these cameras. And the news is reporting on this shit. So in real time, we're seeing this live. And it doesn't matter if you are in Chicago or not. Someone in Minnesota is sitting down for their 6 o'clock news. And they're turning on the news and like, oh, honey, do you see what's happening in Chicago? It's mayhem. Okay, so the biggest day of the event is Wednesday. This is when things really ramp up. This is when we see like some violence. And this is also the official nomination. So this is when the delegates will put in who they want to be like the guy who's going to go run for president. And we're going to figure out who that is today. So this is the one day that Daley actually granted a permit for the protesters at Grant Park. So people begin showing up early again. They're all trickling in, and it equals out to 10,000 again. Everyone that was there before comes back again. So this time he decides to monitor with the police and the National Guard. What does that tell you? Mm-hmm. He's getting ready for a fight. Also, another cool fun fact was that in the beginning of the day, they had these like really cool like hippie artists, you know, like these indie artists that are coming up there, and they had Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Oh, no way!
Yeah,
Peter, Paul, and Mary were there? That's so cool.
Because Grant Park has like a cool like amphitheater kind of thing in it.
Oh, no
And so
way.
he's just up there like singing anti-war songs, and everyone's all like woo and having fun. Then one teenager in the crowd, he sees the American flag and it's flying high, and he's like, oh, hell no. You know, so he does his teenager thing and he climbs the pole, and first he puts it down in half mast, and the police start closing in. They're like, what the fuck is this kid doing? Mm-hmm. Then he tears it down, and these protesters start stomping all over the flag. Yeah. And these police officers were literally just waiting for one of these kids to fuck up. So they start shooting, and they start coming in, and they start just like mass hysteria. So they start to swarm, and they're clubbing people. Like anyone who gets in their way, they're clubbing them. They are like, there's footage of them just beating the absolute shit out of these protesters. The police, there's a small group of police that they say that they're trying to look for one of the protest organizers, Rennie Davis. So they all like, it's like a group of like 5 police officers. They're like, look, where's Rennie? We're gonna kill him. We're gonna kill him. And Rennie Davis was in the documentary I was watching, and he's like, yeah, all of a sudden I just hear, where's Rennie? Let's kill him. They find him, and like 5 or 6 police officers, they don't give him a chance. He's not even a part of this flag thing. He's on the outskirts. Okay. They just start getting into what they want is they want to get the guys that are in charge of the protests. They want to get these big leaders out of there. So they just go in and they beat the shit out of this guy. And he, like, there's like pictures of him with just like blood running down his face. So it's taken a nasty, nasty turn. With all the madness, another protester's like, okay, we're now going to march to the convention, which is 30 blocks away. So this is still in the morning. Yeah. This is still mid-morning.
Oh, okay? Really?
Yes. It's 30 blocks away. And, the police are forming lines on Michigan Avenue because they are not allowing these people to pass. So it takes them like pretty much all day to get there. So by the time the real shit goes down, it's pretty much night. On the inside, the delegate speaking for McGovern says if he is elected, there would be no need for Gestapo tactics in Chicago. And that sets Mayor Daley off. He gets up, him and his cronies, they stand up and they're like, he's saying, fuck you. And they're getting it on camera. And he's like, no, I wasn't saying that. But anyways, he's screaming at him and he's like, how fucking dare you get out of my goddamn city? This city is filled with law and order, and how dare you say otherwise? Okay. Yeah. And how dare you compare us to those dirty rotten commies? Okay. So man, so like I said, police are lined across Michigan Avenue to prevent demonstrators from going any further. So another march on that same day for the Poor People's March, they come through and they actually have a permit with them. So they go up to this line of police officers, they show them the permit. They allow them to pass, right? So then the demonstrators see this as an opportunity and they start pushing past. That's when all hell breaks loose again. They start they start beating people that have nothing to do. Like if you just happened to be there, like if you were, say, like getting off of work at that time and you were heading home, if they saw you, if you came in their line of sight, they would beat the fuck out of you. And like I said, there is footage of this now. People are seeing this. All right. And people are literally sitting at their home just like watching this fucking mayhem break out in Chicago. So demonstrators at this point, because they are just getting beaten up, they start retaliating with rocks and they're shoving them. You know what I mean? So the police try to make it seem like, see, they were being violent too.
Yeah.
They were the ones being violent when they're beating the shit out of them with their weapons.
Yeah.
Okay. And then expecting them just to kind of take it. Inside, Humphrey is chosen as the nominee. People are pissed. The Democratic Party is not having it. So he gives a speech, and his speech, this is the downfall of Humphrey, okay? He aligns himself too closely with Johnson and his policies. And at this point, people are pissed off. There's people not even listening to him. They're all talking amongst each other. They're not giving him the attention that he was seeking. He's talking about, going into the war and taking back the country, and people are just like, fuck, they've had it with him. And also, like, a lot of people had just left. There's like video footage of like whole rows and sections just empty, so this guy gets up and he's like, oh, I did it. And then he looks around and he's like, fuck. So he's kind of, defeated. He's deflated. So we get to the final day. And the final day is kind of, it's not as big as Wednesday was, but it's still doesn't look good. Not looking good.
Still not looking good.
So Humphrey tries to kind of put the Democratic Party back together the next day at the very beginning, and he's like, "Come on, everyone, come on." And he's trying to get everyone back together and on his side and being like, I was voted for. but a lot of the other people are like, there's no way that you were voted for by all these people. No one wanted you, buddy. Mm-hmm. So there's just like this unrest amongst the Democratic Party, and that is the biggest reason. This like interwar in the Democratic Party is why a large part of why the Democrats don't win in the 1968 election. So after this, we have the media reaction. So the world is seeing the violence displayed by the police in pictures and recordings. So we have 250 plus people arrested and 300 plus people put in hospitals and are hurt.
Wow.
Yeah. So people are very upset. The American people are like, what the hell did you do?
Yeah.
And they're all pointing their finger at Mayor Daley. So Mayor Daley goes on air with Walter Cronkite. And they're arguing back and forth. Walter is kind of like, dude, you did them dirty. You did the city dirty. Mm-hmm. Like sending in, like, why would you send in these police officers and this National Guardsman to beat these kids up? They're kids. He said basically that they were exercising their right as citizens to speak up against violence against another country, and they were tired of it. And he's just coming back with like, oh, you don't know anything, blah blah blah. So he gets up and he leaves, and that's kind of like that's when the United States kind of shifts their view of Chicago. Chicago before this wasn't seen as lawless and scary. Yeah. When you hear of Chicago now, you're like, oh, you were on the wrong side of Chicago. Yeah. That's when this like this like bad image of Chicago kind of forms in the American eye. So Daley goes on later to kind of give a statement, and he says that he calls the actions of the police as a necessary evil. And the necessary evil was against a lawless group of terrorists.
He said terrorists again?
He said terrorists.
Double downs on the terrorists, huh?
He really doubles down on the terrorists. And the police officers are basically kind of pushing back with like, well, they were throwing rocks at us. Okay.
Mm-hmm. That's what the helmets are for. A lot
of them, it was a very few amount that were, but also, you know, they kind of had it coming. They were just beating the shit out of these kids for... Yeah. Like, and they were looking for any excuse for violence. So that's kind of where things go south. And this is where we believe that because of the mayhem at the DNC and how the Democratic Party was kind of, you see a split in the Democratic Party for the first time in a long time. Mm-hmm. That pretty much guaranteed Nixon's win in the 1969 election.
Yeah.
So I will end it there.
Wow. Yeah. Dude, that was great.
Thank you.
That was such spectacular detail.
Thank you. It was fun. I love storytelling. That's why I love history so much.
That was a great story. That was so in depth. That was great.
Aw, thanks, honey. Yeah, I had a lot of fun researching it and like hearing all the stories and yeah. Anyways, go ahead, honey.
So we're just going to, real quick, we're going to go back to Nixon. So Nixon's watching this at his hotel, and he is loving every minute of it.
Yeah.
He thinks this is so great. I think it was Pat Buchanan who was like, he loves it. Like, don't elect those crazy Democrats. And what he does is that his first campaign stop of the election is in Chicago. And he gets a ticker tape parade.
Yeah.
So his law and order slogan is just hitting so hard. And basically what he's able to do with this is Nixon gets credited for what's called like the Southern strategy, but really what it is that it's the poor white person strategy. So people who were like those Southern Democrats like Strom Thurmond and people who were working class Northern whites, so like the cops that were beating up all the protesters, union workers. These people were usually classic Democrats. These people were like Democrats for their entire lives, are now seeing this 1968 Democratic Convention, and they're switching to Nixon. Now, what people don't a lot of times get with the party switch is they kind of think that there was just like 1 year where like everybody like changed shirts, right? Or they think it was like a trade, like Kevin Durant or something like that. We're like, oh, they're just wearing new jerseys now. But like that's not what happens. People like their old customs and people like their old traditions and things like that.
Yeah.
But people will also vote for their interests. So Nixon is kind of like the Rosetta Stone. He's kind of like the transitional piece, the missing link, if you will, that shows you where the party switches and what things were attractive to them. Now, this is going to change in Nixon's second term because 1972 is Roe versus Wade.
Yep.
And this brings up a new issue that kind of like wiggles its way into the parties, and then it kind of is another wedge issue, and then they reform in the 90s to where they are kind of like are today.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's one thing I want to like talk about with like George Wallace. So George Wallace is like kind of the guy that everybody compares to Trump.
Yeah.
So yeah,
and he is very much like Trump.
So George Wallace was like a regular Southern Democrat, and what that meant back then was that you were very economically liberal, because all these public programs like the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Association, and Public Works Administration, all these things improved conditions in the South. They built hydroelectric dams, which gave people electricity. They built roads. They built schools. All these things lifted millions of people out of poverty. But the condition was that it was all localized. Mm-hmm. So local governments had the right to say who got these public works administration jobs, who got the benefits, and who didn't. Mm-hmm. And it was almost always white people who got the benefits and non-white people who didn't get those benefits. And in exchange for their unwavering support, no civil rights platforms.
Gotcha.
Nothing on civil rights comes from the Democrat side. That's Republican shit. But in 1948, this changes because our pal Hubert Humphrey introduces a civil rights plank, which gets passed. And our old pal Strom Thurmond walks out of the convention, forms the States Rights Party. They lose, and then it kind of goes away until 57. Mm-hmm. Now, old George Wallace is kind of a struggling, middling Southern Democrat, but in 1957, he runs for governor and loses because he's not as hardline on racial issues as his opponent. 1960.
Oh, and he said some heinous things.
And you got to think, he says some heinous stuff, and he still was not heinous enough in 1957 to be elected governor of Alabama.
Yep.
Because what happens with Brown versus Board of Education in 54, then in 57 with Little Rock, is that they lose control of those public programs. Mm-hmm. And probably the most important public program for them because it was the one involving their children. And so if their children are going to school if these white children are going to school with black children, they're going to start getting along with them, and they're going to start dating them, and then suddenly this veneer of white supremacy is going to just fall to pieces.
Yeah.
So you get this counter reaction to that, which promotes more and more like heinous anti-civil rights stuff, which Wallace hops on board and gets elected in 1962. And in his 1963 inauguration speech, he has the famous line, "And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever." And so this kind of goes into this like twisted view that we're given as kids of civil rights, which we think it started with like Brown versus Board of Education, and then basically ended with Martin Luther King's speech.
Right.
But a few months after that is when Wallace stands in front of the University of Alabama and won't let it be integrated. So he makes a big public play about it, about not integrating schools and states' rights and blah, 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 blah. And pretty soon, more and more civil rights acts are getting passed. So like the Fair Housing Act. Mm-hmm. And then also in 1967, you get Loving versus Virginia, which is the civil rights case that allows interracial marriage. So all these white supremacists are flocking to Wallace for his 1968 campaign. And you see a lot of people who are in his crowd saying stuff that we would associate with people say things about Trump. Mm-hmm. He talks like a regular person. They like that he's a politician.
Yeah.
They don't like Nixon and they don't like Humphrey. So Wallace kind of says what they're feeling.
Right.
A lot of feelings.
Yes,
right.
He goes based on it's very similar to Trump, where his rallies kind of turn into these like just lawless kind of we hate this, huh? So
right.
It's all based on mutual hatred.
It's us versus them politics is what it's called.
Yes.
So it's he turns hard into like the us versus them politics. And then there's a lot of like, well, he's just being honest. Like today people say with Trump is that he has no bullshit. Mm-hmm. Back then they were like, well, Wallace is just being honest, and they found that attractive. He also talks about things that are really important to like middle and working class white people, like trade, like our money going overseas to them. When we were watching that documentary and they showed Wallace's conventions, is Wallace's crowd was trying to capture this post-Civil War Southern Confederate attitude. So like there were Confederate flags, and he was introduced with Dixie playing. A lot of these guys wore like very conventional dress to be anti-counterculture.
Gotcha.
Or Nixon kind of gave like a little lip service to counterculture. Wallace flatly rejected it.
Yeah.
So he was on the exact opposite end. So it was kind of more like politics of what I'm not, which is also very similar to Trump. And they also they wore like conventional clothes, and they just kind of had like the straw hat with Wallace on there. Now, Trump's, I feel it has more of this post 9/11 America feel. So not exactly like the horror we were feeling at 9/11, but kind of like that sense of vengeance. They both have like a down and not
very
out
angry
feeling, right?
Yeah.
So like the Confederates, we're down but we're not out. America after 9/11, we're down but we're not out. We got feelings of pride, we got feelings of vengeance, and similar to how 9/11 was like commercialized to no end. Looking back on this, it's crazy to think that how many books and bumper stickers and tokens and all this stuff. I remember late night TV was full of just crap. Non-stop 9/11 crap. And what do you see with Trump voters? They are covered head to toe with just pieces of plastic crap. But what I mean is like they're two different eras.
Yeah.
Sorry. So mindless Donald Trump like garbage. And they're two different eras, but they have the same feeling.
Yeah.
They have the same feeling of like a little bit sad, like a little bit like melancholy, like kind of how like that
they're down bad.
They're down bad, like they're down bad, same as the Confederacy was, the same as we were post 9/11.
Yeah.
And Trump captures that feeling, and Wallace captured that feeling in people, and he kind of used it to guide them wherever he wanted them to go. Now Wallace doesn't really have a chance of winning. He gets a high percentage of the vote. He gets like 13%, and he wins some states. He's the last third-party candidate to win states, but his chances really get sunk when he has that vice president, a guy named Curtis LeMay, who first question gets asked about nukes, and was just like, yeah, nukes are great. We should definitely use nukes in Vietnam. I think nukes are just, and he just would not shut up. So this gives like Nixon like a layup in his next town hall meeting, which he easily dunks on, that like he's not going to use nukes, which turns out he's lying about. He definitely considers using nukes when he becomes president.
Yes.
Because spoiler alert, he wins in 1968. He has a huge lead for most of the election, but late in the election, Humphrey actually switches, and he says he would stop bombing Vietnam.
Yes. Yeah.
And this kind of gives a little bit of hope, just a little bit of consolidation to the Democratic Party. And again, Nixon doesn't want to debate him, so Nixon pretty much caps out at a certain percentage, and Humphrey is just surging. Now, the next part we're going to say, the end, the kind of twist at the end, is kind of in that historical gray area. It's called the Anna Chennault affair. Basically, Nixon had an in with a South Vietnamese socialite who knew a lot of the South Vietnamese delegates, because at this time we were negotiating peace. The South Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, and the Americans were negotiating in Paris. So what allegedly happens is that Nixon reaches out to Anna Chennault. Well, actually, first he reaches out to Johnson, and they kind of work out a thing because, they both are pro-war, and they're both kind of worried by Humphreys.
Yeah.
So, like, Johnson gives Humphrey his support, but not as much support as you would want. They're getting close to peace at the end. They're getting close to a peace talk. And if a peace gets, like written down, like if it's written down that the Democrats actually have a peace deal, Republicans have no shot because they've solved Vietnam. They've solved the big issue. So now it's just a matter of, Nixon versus Humphrey, and people are going to start to notice a lot more of Nixon's flaws if that's the case.
Yeah.
So what Nixon does is that allegedly he has Anna Chennault tell the South Vietnamese that if they don't sign the peace agreement now and Nixon wins, they'll get a better deal out of Nixon later.
Yeah.
And so this is what sinks Humphrey at the very end. He only loses by like a couple 100,000 votes. And of course, the Electoral College makes it seem like it's a blowout. It's not. It's a very, very close election. Nixon wins. But of course, Nixon has his own problems.
Yeah.
And
we'll see that in 1972.
In 1970.
With Watergate.
Yeah, in 1972, Watergate happens because he's pulling more of his same old tricks. So the last thing I'm going to say is that where this switch, where you can really, if you want to see it, if you want to like hear it, like, and just kind of understand what's happening in the most brutalist terms, there's an interview with a guy named Lee Atwater. And Lee Atwater basically talks about how when you were a Southern Democrat, all you needed to talk about was, I'm a racist, vote for me. But after that changed in the 1960s, now you couldn't just go out there and say, I'm a racist, because you'll lose. What happens is that he says that now you talk about other things like busing, or you talk about taxes, and eventually you talk about something that is so far removed that you're not even talking about race anymore. But what happens is whites benefit, blacks don't. And this becomes policy under Reagan. The event where this is kind of hammered home is when Reagan is campaigning in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights workers back in 1964 were murdered. And he goes there and he talks about states' rights and local control of education.
All right, we're going to end it there.
And we're going to end it there.
We are running out of time, quite literally. Our battery is about to die, and our SIM card is at its limit. So we are going to end it here. We are going to keep talking about politics and the comparison, and we will see you next week.
Thank you all so much for listening.
Bye.